All right, good morning. It is so good to be with you this morning, and I also was really blessed by all those testimonies. Kind of wish that maybe it kept going a little bit longer, then I wouldn't have to preach. No, I like preaching. So it's really good to be together. I will say that this church experience was definitely not my church experience growing up. I was in a church that I actually did not enjoy being a part of. I see our kids running off to junior church. That was definitely not me. I was like, oh, I hate this, right? So that was my experience growing up. I left the church as quickly as I could. And then I told some of this story last week that I met some Christians in high school. They invited me to a youth group. I got involved. I started asking a lot of questions, and especially there's one guy, I gotta give a shout out to Doug. I haven't seen him since. So Doug, if you're watching, shout out to you. So Doug, he was incredibly patient with me and my questions. And I think I kind of gave him a hard time, to be honest with you. And a part of it was because he was bugging me. At least that's the way it felt to me, because I was going to this youth group to have fun. And he kept kind of ruining it by talking about Jesus, And I'm like, oh, dude. And so in an event, but I would ask him questions, and I remember feeling like, this guy is really smart. Like, he really knows his Bible. And I recognized I was asking a lot of questions, but I wasn't, I had never read the Bible. And so his response was actually really helpful to me in my own sort of spiritual journey, as it were. Doug was very persistent. I believe now that he was praying for me, and I think that he would frequently ask if I was ready to give my life to Jesus, and I said no. I'm never going to do that, at least not while I'm young and healthy. Seriously, this is exactly what I said to him. Maybe when I'm gravely ill, or maybe when I'm old and decrepit, maybe then I'll be so desperate that I'll believe what you... But until then, I'm good. So how is it that I went? A month before I graduated from college is actually when I gave my life to Jesus. And I will just simply say that, and I talked a little bit about this last week, that the reason why I actually ended up giving my life to Christ, it wasn't because all of my questions got answered. Some of them did. But actually, I still had a lot of questions even when I gave my life to Christ. It's because I recognized my need for Jesus. I recognized that I needed help. And the more I was learning about Jesus, the more I was like, it actually makes sense to ask him for help. So that's kind of what it was. And he hasn't failed me yet. Yeah, right? You guys know. So, all right, so we're talking about Christianity. We're in a second week, the second week of a series called That's a Good Question. Last week, the question was, is there more to life than this? This week, the question is, who is Jesus? So we're going to talk a little bit about the evidence for Christianity, or the evidence for Jesus, because some of you have figured out, I studied mathematics. I love all things mathematics. It just makes so much sense. And I do believe that God probably was a mathematician. But having said that, you can't prove Christianity mathematically. There are people who try, but you cannot. You can't prove it scientifically. Science is super important, and we're really glad for good scientists. But science answers different kinds of questions than faith. Science asks questions and answers questions like when and how, for instance, did this world come to be? That's something that scientists are pretty interested in. But people of faith ask questions like, yeah, but who made it and why? Right? So different kinds of questions, yeah? So both have a role, and an important role to play in a modern society like ours. So I have this beautiful Pyrex dish. Why? It's not just because I'm hungry, but I know what's in this Pyrex dish, and I'm going to tell you. They are dark chocolate Ghirardelli brownies with chocolate chips. Natalie, would you come up here and just grab these from me now? Because I don't need them anymore. Yeah. And you are going to exercise self-control. All right, there you go. I know how much she loves these brownies. So I could actually probably give these brownies to Dr. Walker over here, who works in the chemistry department at Potsdam, and he might be able, I don't know, but he might be able to analyze them a little bit and might be able to tell us as a scientist, like maybe when the brownies were made and maybe what some of the ingredients are of the brownies, all that kind of stuff. That's really cool. But what he wouldn't be able to tell us necessarily is like who made the brownies and why. See? But I actually can. I can answer that question. The answer is Beverly made the brownies. Woo! And I can tell you why she made the brownies. She made the brownies, right, because she wanted to help me with this visual aid. That's one reason, because I asked her to. But also so that we can share them at the Welcome Back picnic afterwards. Yeah, there you go. So that's awesome. So science plays a role, faith plays a role. Science is so important, but faith is also important because it answers very fundamental questions about life. And actually, everyone has faith, if you will. Even the atheists have faith that there's not a God. Like, that's a conviction and a belief that they have, that there is no God. But interestingly, atheists can't prove that either, mathematically or scientifically. So it's all a step of faith, really, everybody on this planet. So I honestly would not be able to stand up in front of 100 people or so and say that I'm a Christian if there wasn't some kind of evidence. I'm just not wired that way. And so if you want me to do something or believe something, it needs to be proven or demonstrated. That's the way my brain works. And I'm thankful to God for that. I'm very thankful that Christianity is not the kind of faith that says you got to leave your brains behind in order to believe it. Or you have to take a blind leap of faith. There's a difference between that and a step of faith. So I think that there's really good historical evidence for who Jesus is and for Christianity and what we believe. And so we're going to dive into that here quickly. So scientific evidence, like the kind that Martin experiences week in, week out in his lab. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence that is helpful to get people to come to certain conclusions. A lawyer, for instance, uses historical evidence. There's that kind of evidence. Every time, for instance, a jury brings back a verdict, they're doing this on the basis of things that have happened in history. The evidence of history in addition to any pertinent scientific evidence. But once all the evidence is presented, every jury has to make a decision, right, based on the presented evidence. That's the best they have, right? They weren't there. They didn't see it. They have to take the evidence and then come to a conclusion, right? This is a step of faith. And it's exactly the same way, or I should say it's almost exactly the same way as making up our minds about who Jesus is. I came to believe in God because of Jesus Christ. It seems to me that the resurrection of Jesus, which I came to believe in, and we're going to come back to this here in a moment, that the resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests that the world has a creator, and that this creator is to be seen in terms of and through the lens of Jesus Christ. And it makes total sense to me now, but it didn't always, but now it does. It makes total sense to me, this thing about seeing God in Jesus. If you want to get to know someone, they need to reveal themselves to you. They have to be the one that takes the initiative and kind of opens up. You can't get to know somebody if they're not willing to reveal themselves, if you will. And God wants us to know him. And so he has revealed himself, not in the form of an ant or even a beautiful hummingbird, right? But in the form of a person that we know and worship as Jesus Christ. How are we doing? Okay. So what is this evidence? There's a lot of big talk up here, so let's talk about some of the evidence. So is there even evidence that Jesus existed? This is going to be a review for some of you. It's going to be new for many of you. Is there any evidence even that Jesus existed? Well, you might say, yeah, I think that Jesus is an awesome myth, and, I can understand that he's an inspiring figure, but I don't actually think that he walked this earth. But there's actually overwhelming historical evidence for his life. And so we know from outside of the New Testament, which is the Christian last third of the Bible, we know from evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus did, in fact, exist as a human being. And so we have well-respected in all kinds of other ways, but really well-respected Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius. So the first century Roman Jewish historian, military leader, Flavius Josephus, wrote this. These names are a mouthful. I don't know why they're not called Bob and Frank, but here we are, Flavius Josephus. So this is what he wrote about Jesus. And this is first century. There was about this time Jesus, a doer of wonderful works. And this one sentence is taken from a very long excerpt from Josephus and what he had to say about Jesus. And it's very detailed, and it's very clear that he's referring to the same Jesus that we read about in the New Testament. Because he goes on and he actually talks about this Jesus' crucifixion and even his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament by secular Roman historians and Jewish historians at the time, not following Jesus as Lord, but were aware of his existence as a human being. Of course, the New Testament was written a long time ago. So when we take a look at the evidence of Jesus' life in the New Testament, some argue and they say, well, how on earth can we know that those things are reliable? And so the answer is that we actually can know that the writings of the New Testament are incredibly reliable and accurate. And we know this through a method called textual criticism, which I won't say a whole lot about, but it's a really cool scientific approach to discerning the credibility of manuscripts of anything, of works of antiquity, including the Bible. I'm going to skip a large section because the sharing was so amazing, and I want to make sure that we get out of here on time. But I will say that the historical evidence for the reliability of the New Testament is incredibly generous. And so as a person who has had to wrestle through the reliability of the Bible, Old and New Testament, I've come out saying the evidence is clear. It is incredibly reliable. And if you want to talk more about this, I'd be really happy to, either after the service or over coffee, anywhere. That would be delightful. One of the greatest ever textual critics, F.J.A. Hort, said this: in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings. And very few secular historians would disagree with this. So we know, both from within and outside the New Testament, that Jesus existed, but who actually is he? We know that he was fully human, that he had body, that he had emotions, he had experiences. And a lot of people would kind of agree with that. Even people that aren't here and would never come to a church like this, they would basically agree that Jesus was a person and had a physical body. But they would say that, yeah, he was a great human being. He was super inspiring. But I wouldn't go as far as saying that he was like the Son of God or equal to God. That's going too far, right? You hear this all the time. That's when there's pushback. So let's just dive into that question really quick. I'm going to look at two questions. What did Jesus first think about himself? Because that's important. If Jesus did not think that he was God, then what's the point of even talking about it? The case is over, right? But Jesus did think that he was God. So we're going to look at that. But was he right about his self-awareness or his self-assessment? So what did Jesus think about himself, and was he right? So what did he think about himself? The first bit of evidence that we're going to look at is that his teaching was centered on himself, right? He wasn't like, oh, go look at God and worship him and go there. He actually would frequently and repeatedly say, no, come to me. Come to me. Very significant. Last week, I mentioned how common it is for people to get filled up with like meat and veggies and all that kind of stuff and say, oh, I couldn't eat anything else until they see the dessert dinner, and then suddenly this other stomach opens up out of nowhere and there's suddenly room for as much of that pie as, whatever. So we talked about this two different stomach idea, and I'll just kind of just say that I think that I think all people have a spiritual craving that will not get fulfilled, right, until it is filled up with God through Jesus Christ. Jesus was the one who said, whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Those are good words from Jesus, right? Okay. We also carry around, a lot of us, some stuff in our own personal lives, things like worry, things like anxiety and fear and shame and guilt. And I've talked about some of my own stuff. But Jesus says more good words. He says, come to me, right? All who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. This is something that Jesus is able to do. Most of us have stuff in our lives that we actually are not particularly proud of, or things that we don't like. I think that I've mentioned this before. So before I was a Christian, had a really disgusting mouth, is all I'll just say. And so I grew up sailing on a boat, and and I knew how to talk like a sailor. And we'll just leave it at that. But I also had other really bad habits. And actually addictions, I would say. I didn't know that at the time, but and these bad habits, these addictions, they were definitely hurting me. They were hurting other people, and certainly they were hurting God. Jesus said, though, when I set you free, you will be totally free. This was really good news for me because I wanted to be free. And Jesus promised that he would set me free. So Jesus has done this. Thank God. He set me free. And there's a funny story about how I knew that I was free from my foul mouth one time when I fell off of a ladder, which I've told before, but that's for another time. Jesus said, if you receive me, you receive God. And if you have seen me, you have seen God. I heard a story about a little girl. She was in school, and she was drawing a picture, and the teacher said, oh, that's a beautiful picture. What are you drawing? Drawing God. And the teacher said, well, you can't do that. Like, nobody even knows what God looks like. And the little girl said, they will as soon as I'm done. I love it. Jesus said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. If you've seen me, you've seen God. Jesus said it this way in John 10:30. He said, I and the Father are one. And the people that were around him when they heard him say that, that was he stepped over the line, right? And they were like, that's it. That is blasphemy, and we are justified now in picking up these stones and killing you. And the reality is, this is still the kind of the reaction of some people when you declare this reality that Jesus and the Father are one. It's very offensive to some people. So they might pick up stones. Don't you ever pick up a stone. You lay down your life. Yeah. Jesus said, I have shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? Is his response. We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, is how they were seeing him, claimed to be God. Jesus made a lot of direct claims about his identity, but he also made a lot of indirect claims. We'll look at these quickly. For instance, he claimed to forgive sin. He once forgave the sin of a lawyer, and the lawyer said, how can you do that? No one can forgive sin but the Father. And Jesus said, that's right. That's right. Because I and the Father are one. Only God can forgive sin, and this is the reason why Jesus was able to forgive his sin. And forgiveness, I was mentioning this to a brother earlier this morning, that forgiveness is really at the heart of Christianity. C.S. Lewis said, a Christian is someone who forgives the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in us. Forgiveness is really at the heart of our faith. C.S. Lewis just said what I just read. So I'll go to the next paragraph. If you look honestly at the evidence, I just think it's convincing to me at looking at his multiple direct and his indirect claims to be God. But anybody can go around and claiming to be God. And a lot of people do. Obviously, before we believe anybody, even Jesus, we need to examine the evidence. And so it's possible that Jesus was making the whole thing up, in which case I would say he's the world's greatest liar if he was just making it all up. Or maybe he really thought that he was. He had this sort of delusion about it, and he really thought that he was, in which case I would say he's the world's greatest lunatic. And I don't know what else. But a third possibility is that he was speaking the truth about who he really was. And in fact, if this really is the case, which I think it is that it makes Jesus Christ the greatest Lord of all. And we all have to decide for ourselves, liar, lunatic, or Lord. C.S. Lewis, he's an intellectual giant, the person I quoted almost twice about a minute ago. He's best known for his works, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or the Chronicles of Narnia. This is what he wrote. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher, as some people want to reduce him to be. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God or else insane or something worse. But let's not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that option open to us, and he did not intend to. I think that's absolutely right. So was Jesus right about what he said? So this is what he claimed, is to be equal to God, to be God. Was he right? Let's look quickly at some of the evidence here. We're going to look at his teaching first. It is undisputed that Jesus was one of the best teachers of all times. This is not a disputed fact. And you just read the teachings of Jesus, anybody, and they're going to be, whoa, this guy was incredible. He would say things that was so radical and so incredibly helpful, like love your neighbor as yourself, right? Profound. Do to other people as you would have them do to you. Does the world need more of this? The world needs more of this kind of teaching and living, right? The kind that Jesus taught. And Jesus actually was the very first person to teach this, to love your enemies. Incredibly radical at the time. And Jesus says, love your enemies. Many people around the world, Jesus' teaching actually is the foundation for their modern civilization, including our own. Many of our laws were originally founded on the teachings of Jesus. And I love the story about this book with the coffee bean or whatever. And the way, did I get that sort of right? I don't know, Caitlin's still here. Yeah, so this idea of Jesus and his teaching still influencing us today in our modern civilization. So again, many of the laws were founded on Jesus' teaching. We're advancing, and we all know this, in every field of science and technology at an incredibly accelerated rate. And yet, in 2,000 years, no one has been able to improve upon the moral teachings of Jesus, right? So some things are getting better, other things not so much. We need to return to the standard that Scott was talking about, the moral teachings, the biblical teachings of Jesus. Jesus' teachings are the greatest words that were ever spoken. They're words as if they were given to us by God. Because they were. You look at the things that Jesus did. I used to think that Christians were boring. I now believe that Christians are anything but boring because Jesus was not boring. I used to think that Jesus was the kind of guy that would go around turning wine into water. I'll let that sink in a little bit. Yep, okay. That's Didn't go very well. But Jesus, we read in the New Testament, he would frequently go to like weddings or parties. He wasn't afraid of that kind of stuff. And he did some really cool things at these events, at these social events. Many of you remember this story when Jesus was at this wedding and they ran out of the wine. And so Jesus miraculously provided the wine, and it was the best wine in the whole region. So Jesus was anything but a bore. He actually was the life of the party, and that's the way that I think of him now. And we, as Christ followers, are invited to live this kind of life in a way that honors him. He performed all kinds of miracles that only God could perform. Praying for people's spiritual needs, physical needs. He did this with incredible amount of humility. He once said, I'm here inviting the sin sick, not the spiritually fit. This tells you a little bit about where Jesus was at. He was devoted to demonstrating the love of God and the justice of God for the marginalized, for the people who were the riffraff of society that were left out and not invited into cool things like this. Jesus went out and cared for them the way that he calls us also to go and be a blessing, as Mark reminded us. Jesus' character has impressed millions of people who wouldn't necessarily call themselves Christians. For us older folks, you might remember this Time magazine. I think I've got it up there. Alan is trying to keep up with me. So there's a cover. Time magazine once said that Jesus is the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of humanity. Time wasn't saying, so give your life to Jesus. They were just saying, this guy is awesome. Yeah, that's all. Even his enemies couldn't find fault with him, and his friends who spent a lot of time with him said to their death, the guy was guiltless. The guy was guiltless. He had no sin within him. So when weighing the evidence about Jesus' claim to be God, his fulfillment of prophecies, super significant. I'm going to skip over this section also. Just suffice it to say that there's an insane amount of prophecy that Jesus fulfilled. And you might say, well, sure, he had access to the Old Testament. So at some point, 12 years old or whatever, he was opening up there in the temple and he said, oh, I'm supposed to do that. Oh, I'm supposed to do that. Oh, okay, and now I'm supposed to do this. And so he would just say, I better get busy fulfilling some of these Old Testament prophecies. And that would work for some of those prophecies, but it wouldn't work, for instance, for the one where he was supposed to be born. Because by the time Jesus came across that prophecy, it was like a little too late, right? So Jesus even fulfilled the prophecies that he had no human power to control. You get that? Yeah, it's pretty cool. There's so much there. Jesus, he claimed to destroy, this is super significant, he came to destroy death. And we sang about that this morning. He came to destroy death. In fact, this claim is a cornerstone of Christianity. And it's so relevant because statistically speaking, every single one of us will die. Right? Sorry. Sorry, I meant to keep it positive this morning. Oh, I just ruined your life. So The Onion is a satirical magazine, once published this headline: world death rate holds steady at 100%. It's really no headline at all. So that's the reality. The Victorians, you've heard about the Victorians. They have a reputation of being comfortable talking about death, but very uncomfortable talking about sex. In our culture, it almost seems the opposite. We talk a lot about sex in our culture, but we don't talk very much about death. In fact, it's sort of a taboo subject, especially in some people's homes, and even in some people's in some hospitals, I've been told. In some hospitals, they're told, don't use the word death. Refer to it as a negative patient care outcome. That's a politically correct way to say that. Okay, so there you go. Well, we have this fear of death, but talk about sex all day long. Okay, call it what you will. We all die. And when you go to a funeral and the coffin goes in the ground, it looks final, doesn't it? It's awful. And it is. Unless Jesus actually did destroy death. Unless when Jesus died and he was buried and he was raised to life, if that happened, then it's a game changer. And what Jesus says about death is true. He destroyed it. If this is all true, then there actually is hope and healing beyond this life. So is this all just wishful thinking? We just need something to hold on to because life is hard and we need something to believe in. Otherwise, we're going to get really depressed or something. So is it wishful thinking? I don't think it's just wishful thinking, although it is good thinking. There's a lot of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, from the empty tomb to people. Some really cool, interesting facts about the empty tomb, which we're not going to take the time to get into, but also the very fact that people saw Jesus after his resurrection. And not just a few, but it's recorded that there was, at one point, at least 500 people that all saw it. And so I hear people kick back and they say, well, they were hallucinating or something, they were on something. And, so I understand that people do hallucinate and can see things, but 500 people, that's 5 times the number of people that are here. And I think it just takes more faith to believe that they were hallucinating than actually that they saw the resurrected Jesus. It's just where I'm at. And then also, a whole bunch of these people who saw the resurrected Jesus went to their own gruesome death, being crucified or being beheaded or whatever, because they saw the resurrected Jesus. They could have said, we were only kidding. They didn't. They said, no, we saw the resurrected Jesus. This is who Jesus is. So as a result of this movement, it's actually unprecedented in human history, in the history of the world. And it continues to transform lives. It certainly transform my own. There's an estimated 2.4 billion Christians in the world today, of every ethnicity, on every continent, every nationality, every economic, social, and intellectual background, and they all speak of this. They all testify to this, that we have seen and experienced the resurrected Jesus. Yes? Anybody? Yeah. So when we look at what Jesus claimed about himself, it's really clear that he claimed to be God. Was he a liar? Was he a lunatic? When we look at the evidence of his teaching, the things that he did, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection, it just seems to me to be absurd or illogical or even unbelievable to say that he was insane or a fraud based on all the evidence that I have access to and that we have access to. On the other hand, it provides the strongest possible supporting evidence that what Jesus said about himself was true, that he, in fact, is Lord of all. Okay. How are we doing? Oh, that was a mouthful. All right. If I could get the musicians up here, help me out, that'd be great. We need to end this service. All right. So there we go. That's a little bit about who Jesus is. He's God come in the flesh. And he is God who loves us more than we'll ever know. He's God who is able to forgive us. He's a God who's able to give us hope. He's a God who's able to bring healing. He's a God who's able to take this life and turn it into something worthwhile, something useful, something good. I have grabbed a hold of the reality of the John 10:10 passage. It's been so inspiring to me when Jesus said, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. And this is the kind of life I've been leaning into for the last 46 years. May God help me to remain faithful. May God help us to remain faithful to this Jesus, the one he loves. Jesus Christ has radically changed my life. He's radically changed many of our lives here together. And it's totally awesome. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to worship. God in heaven, thank you for your son, Jesus Christ, and allowing us to see you for who you really are. God, we pray that you would deepen our love for you. And God, that you would deepen our response. Even as we respond in worship now, God, would we respond not just with our voices, but with our lives? There's going to be a gazillion opportunities even throughout the rest of this day and certainly this week to be like Jesus and to point people to you. As Mark said, bless us, God, in this way to be a blessing. We love you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.